Okay, so number one, a declaration of theologians has been signed condemning the teaching of the Russian world. What is this Russian world? Is it the Russian world that Vladimir Putin so often references?
Yes, exactly. This is the sort of the Russian world that the declaration condemns. It has its roots. The doctrine of the Russian world has its roots in the 90s. It had some significant modifications in the meantime in the 2000s, early 2000s. This idea was taken over by the church, and the church elaborated upon this idea and shaped it into a different kind of doctrine, the doctrine which is still active, and it frames the Russian aggression, the Russian war in Ukraine. So essentially, one can say that the formula of this war in Ukraine is very simple. It's like an equation: guns plus ideas equal war. So the Putin's regime supplied guns to this formula, and I'm afraid the church has supplied ideas to this formula. And exactly the component of ideas in this formula is exactly this doctrine of the Russian world. That's why the theologians who have drafted and signed the petition, and the process of signing continues, they realize the core, as it were, of the aggression of the war. At the core is ideological, or one may say a distorted theology, ideologized theology, or theologized ideology, whatever you prefer. It's a kind of really a hybrid between theology and ideology, and it unfortunately does underpin the war. It should be said that originally this idea was, as I said, it was formed as it is by the church. Then the Kremlin adopted the language and the actually the ideas as such from the church. And the last that we heard about this doctrine was in this famous or infamous, notorious speech by Putin on the eve of the war, of the aggression on the 21st of February, when he clearly referred to the ideas pertinent to this Russian world doctrine.
Mm-hmm. So could you briefly outline what the Russian world is?
Right, yes. So it's a form of exceptionalism, or one may say a nationalism. That's why, by the way, the theologians of this declaration rightly, I believe, identify the Russian world as a form of Phyletism. It's like a term coined by the Orthodox theologians in the 19th century when they condemned nationalism, different forms of nationalism. Literally, Phyletism means tribalism, and it's, in other words, it's a sort of exceptionalism, when, which means that to belong to a tribe makes you kind of different, makes you exceptional, endows standing from God, standing from the divine providence. And if you expand this idea of tribe, exceptional kind of tribe, to the civilization, as the Russian world suggests, then you have this doctrine of the Russian world. So essentially, the Russian world is a tribalism to the scale of a civilization. When a civilization of what they call the Russian civilization is believed to be exceptional, with a special mission in the world to save the world from itself. It's like the embodiment of the cosmic good. It's like the bearer, the vehicle of the divine providence in sustaining, this world. So all those kind of crazy ideas, essentially, that drive people like Putin and his followers. Many people in Russia have subscribed to this ideology. Mm-hmm. They believe that their mission is really divine, cosmic. It's about, fighting the global evil represented by the Western countries, the US, the NATO, and Russia is essentially for them the incarnation of this cosmic goodness. From this perspective, the Russian world is not just a political ideology, I would say. It's not just a set of political ideas. As, for example, one can see, the idea of the European Union, which is purely political. The idea of the Russian world is also metaphysical. it is it is driven exactly by this idea of counterposition between sacrality and profanity, between the holiness of Rus, of Russia, as they identify themselves, Holy Rus, and what they call unholiness and godlessness of the West. So that's why it is important to take into consideration religion when we try to understand the war. That's why the theologians address this war and try to explain this war theologically, because I think it makes sense. Without that component, one can hardly fully understand what is going on in Ukraine with the war.
How does Russia know that it's on the good side of things? How does it know that it's on the holy side of things and that all the rest of the world is profane? How does it justify that?
Yes, it's certainly a delusion. And we see from the fruits of this delusion that this is the delusion. The fruits of the delusion is destruction, the loss of human life, human sufferings, unimaginable, to the scale unimaginable in our times. So as the gospel says, from the fruits you will know the tree. So the fruits, the disastrous, murderous fruits indicate what kind of tree it is, what kind of ideology it is. Yes, the Russians believe that this ideology represents like the divine truth and the inspired to and act on behalf of God, as it were, even though it's as I said, it's a delusion, because they have produced an idea, and this idea is an intrinsic part of the Russian world doctrine. The idea of the so-called traditional values. They say that, well, the West has been corrupted by liberal ideas, by liberal values, and Russia needs to preserve kind of this, to save the world from those dangerous, as they say, ideas. In Russia, they've developed this concept of the traditional values that, as they believe, represent the Christian beliefs, and they're conservative, they're anti-liberal, and essentially for the Russians, this cosmic battle between Russia and the godless West is essentially a battle between two ideologies: the ideology of conservatism and liberalism. In a sense, one can say that the war is a continuation of the culture wars that the rest of the world knows very well, like especially the United States. I sometimes call that the culture wars is they are not about culture nor about the wars. But in the case of of Ukraine, we are facing a situation that when a culture war has become a real war, when this battle for values or for ideological maxims like conservatism and liberalism has led us to the situation when people take guns in their arms and go to fight for, to protect those values. So that's why, well, this idea, this belief in the traditional values makes the Russians believing that their mission is holy and they are on the side of God. And actually, it should be said that many people in the world, across the world, Christians, including Christians, and not only Christians, but also Muslims and other people of other religions, have been convinced to support Russia in this battle. That's why we see these strange alliances between like white evangelicals in the United States and the Kremlin. We can observe, sympathy to the cause of Russia, to the cause of Putin, even under the circumstances of the war, from some conservative circles in the Catholic Church, in the Protestant churches, like some kind of conservative Protestant churches, like Pentecostal Church. We can see the same kind of convergence between the Russian ideology and the radical Islam, because, well, for many radical Muslims, especially for the supporters of Daesh and those caliphates in the Middle East, they see Russia as fighting their common enemy, this global shaitan. They have the same kind of dualistic, polarized worldview that contraposes, their own values, their own country against the godless West. In this, they concur. I mean, the Daesh agenda essentially concurs with the agenda of the Kremlin. So yeah, that's a global phenomenon. It's not just about the war in Ukraine. That's why, and it's all not that the Orthodox Church needs to be blamed for that. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church. It should be clarified that theology per se, religion per se, is not to be blamed for that. What we are dealing with is a distortion of religion. That's why we have a clear condemnation of the Russian world doctrine from some churches like the Ecumenical Patriarchate or the theologians who have signed the petition. So we need to be very clear. It's not about religion as such. It's about the distortion of religion. And to address this problem, it's not to eliminate religion as such, to extract religion from this equation. It's about restoring the orthodoxy of religion, if you want, the orthodoxy of orthodoxy, to restore the kind of normal Christian understanding of what is religion.
So we can say that this is basically heresy, like we had heresy.
That's exactly so. Yes, exactly. In the language of our own tradition, and this language has been used in the declaration, this is a heresy. And the heresy needs to be corrected, needs to be addressed.
Can we say that the Russian world, this ideology, is the basis of Russia's geopolitical actions today? Can we say that most Russians share this viewpoint in Russia? And
yes,
can we say that Russian chauvinism and imperialism that all Ukrainians are aware of, is it a result of this ideology?
Yes, I believe so. Maybe the Russian chauvinism is not a result of the ideology, because this ideology is kind of later than the Russian chauvinism or Russian imperialism. But in the present situation, in Putin's Russia, they converged and they enhance each other. Russian chauvinism, as we know, existed, for centuries. It pretty much underpinned the existence of the Romanovs Empire. Different peoples suffered in this empire, including the Ukrainian people, as we know from our history. But when the Russian world was articulated with this metaphysical dimension, with this idea of traditional values, then the idea of Russian chauvinism was boosted, was upgraded to a new level, to the level of war.
And we can also say that the average Russian, he also shares this ideology, right? It's something that they're...
Unfortunately, I believe it is so. It's not just, yes, there are attempts we see now in the in the narratives, in the discourses in the West, to differentiate between Putin and his kind of circle and the rest of Russians. I believe, I understand the motivation for such differentiation, because our modern civilization doesn't tend to blame people for what is going on, for the disasters. But in the case of Russia, I think it is very clear that Putin has the support of the majority, regardless of the sanctions. And what is the basis of this support? It's essentially, it's a sort of cultural Christianity, if you want. It's a sort of identity-based Christianity. When people identify themselves with the church without really belonging or believing, in the church, or even without believing in God, so maybe up to 5% of the Russians would go to the church, and like 60 to 70%, different surveys, bring different figures, would identify themselves as Orthodox. And those who identify themselves as Orthodox without belonging or believing, they are, in the sociology, they are called cultural Christians, and they essentially believe in a mixture of ideology and theology, and they exactly support Putin. And that's why Putin employs this language, because he knows this language would consolidate the majority of the Russians around him and around this absolutely meaningless, absolutely murderous campaign war.
Well, does the modern ideology of the Russian world actually have an author? We heard that Alexander Dugin was very influential in forming Putin's worldview. Did he take part in forming this doctrine?
Partially so, but Dugin is a Eurasian. The Russian world is not exactly a Eurasian ideology. Yes, they converge in many points, but they are not identical. That's why I would say that the main part was played in forming this ideology was played by the church. And I believe personally Metropolitan Kirill at the time, and then Patriarch Kirill, who became Patriarch Kirill, is actually the author of this ideology.
Wow. I have no words. Why did the church do this?
I think the original idea of the church was to attract people by filling the void, ideological void that had emerged as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the ideology, the communist ideology that framed the Soviet Union collapsed as well. And this left a void, which many people felt it, including Putin. And if you kind of see the way how Putin tried to explain his behavior or his motivation, we see a clear disappointment of his disappointment in the communist ideology. So this disappointment was very widely spread. And this ideology was widely spread. This disappointment was widely spread, and the church saw this as an opportunity to evangelize essentially people by attracting them to Christianity through an ideology. That's why this construct was created, which combined a mixture of theological ideas and ideological. The idea was essentially to evangelize people, but it backfired. Instead of Christianizing the ideologized Russian population, this ideology produced a situation of ideologizing the Christian church. So the effect was the opposite, the reverse from what it was expected, and certainly it means that the church has been ideologized, has been Putinized, if you want, as a result of this. And as a result of this, the church needs to be de-putinized.
Right. Can you tell a little bit about the predecessor of the Ruski Mir, the Phyletism that you mentioned? How did it emerge? How was it condemned? And what role did it play in the geopolitical processes of that time?
Yes. Well, Phyletism emerged as a result of the processes of a national awakening in the 19th century, the so-called Spring of Nations, that happened in the Western Europe mostly, as we know, and then it also spread to the east, to the territories of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and the Russian Empire. And the idea was basically the following: that if a people, a nation, has the ultimate value, so that the religious identity of the people, or the religious kind of status of that people, should be defined by the national identity. So it's essentially Phyletism it's when the national identity is superior to the Christian identity. To speak kind of basic, to kind of summarize this idea, and this has been condemned as a as a heresy. And what we are dealing with in the Russian world is exactly the same. That just because we are, they say, just because we are the Russian world, we are the Russian civilization, we can define what the church is, and we can define how the church should operate. That's why, in the spirit of this exceptionalism, for example, the Russians decided to advance to Africa. That is kind of now a minor episode, but it was big before the war, when the Russian church opened its structures in Africa, exactly following this idea that we are exceptional, we are special, we are eligible to do whatever we want in other churches on the other territories, including the ancient Church of Alexandria, which had been established by the ecumenical councils in the early Christian era. So this is just a symptom of the phenomenon of the disease of Phyletism that brings the national identity, in the case of the Russian world, it's civilizational identity above any other, including Christian identity and Christian belief.
So at the time, Phyletism, did it play a role in any wars like today?
It did, unfortunately. If you remember, for example, the Balkan Wars in the beginning of the 20th century, there were two Balkan Wars in around 1915, 1912 through 1915. Those wars were basically between the Orthodox nations, like the Bulgarians fought Serbians, Greeks, Romanians, and the other way around. Those wars were also underpinned by Phyletism. So it's not what we are facing now in Ukraine. It's not a new thing. It's tragic. It's huge. Probably it's more disastrous than the Balkan Wars, of course. But it's not a kind of something new. And unfortunately, the Orthodox churches did not, reflect properly on the results, on the reasons of those wars, on the on the wars that existed, that were waged in the 20th century. That's why we have a repetition of those wars.
Right.
In order to avoid the repetition of the war that we have in Ukraine, we really need to do our homework very well, theologians. We need to deconstruct those ideologies that continue underpinning violence and war.
So, as part of this process, this goal, you mentioned that it's necessary to de-putinize the Russian Orthodox Church. How does this declaration propose doing that?
Yes, well, I don't have a ready recipe for that. It needs to be discussed among the theologians. It needs to be kind of a collective effort of many people, thinkers, intellectuals. It needs to be an intellectual process of reflection, deconstruction, and criticism, critique of this doctrine. The process is ongoing. It's not that it hasn't started. No, it started some time ago, and I'm very happy to be a part of it from the very beginning. And the declaration that you mentioned in the beginning, it's just a kind of one of the things, one of the results of this process, and I hope it's not the last one. It should be similar to the process of denazification of theology, or detotalitarianization of theology that emerged in the interwar period in Europe, because the Western theologians, including the Catholic and Protestant theologians, had been affected by the same kind of totalitarian ideas. They had some kind of, I would call them totalitarian theologies in the 30s, especially. Some Orthodox theologians also concurred with that trend. And the Catholic and the Protestant churches did a very good work, homework to overcome these theologies after the World War II. They produced what they call the theology after Auschwitz. And we probably need a similar theology after the Ukrainian war, exactly to address the ideological basement of the war, and in order to avoid the repetition of this war again on the same basis.
Okay, and finally, final question. Could you explain why the Russian world is counter-Christian? Why is it against Christianity? And what would you say to those people among Christians and other believers that support Russia and implicitly the Russian world because they are critical of globalization and the current situation in the world?
Well, I think some ideas on which the Russian world bases itself resonates, with the Christian beliefs. But we are dealing with an abuse, with a distortion of those ideas. It's a sort of manipulation, if you want, around those ideas. It's the same kind of manipulation as in the case of idols substituting God. So essentially, I believe the Russian world is a sort of idolatry. When they produce, resemblances of God. Idols are the resemblances of God, right? And they venerate those idols instead of God. Those idols are the idea of civilization that substitutes the idea of the kingdom of God. Those ideas include also the idea of traditional values that substitute the idea of love in Christ, divine love. Those substitutes are also ideologies that substitute theology, proper theology of the church. So we are dealing with the idols. That's why it's wrong. It's misleading because it's really hard sometimes to distinguish, to identify an idol, and to distinguish an idol from whom this idol represents, God. But yes, as Christians, we need to be very careful not to venerate, idols, to remember the first commandment of the revelation given to Moses, to not venerate idols, venerate only one God. So that's the advice. That is the, if you want, a solution, a principle of deconstruction of this ideology, which needs to be followed.
So what would you say to the people who support Russia, basically, and the Russian world because they're critical of globalization and the current world order?
well, I just can say, look at the results. Yes, because Russia presented itself as a proponent, as a leader in the process of resistance to globalization. And the result is just the destruction of everything. Look at the Ukraine. This war is really, it's much more, it's different even from the war in the Gulf, which was, live filmed on CNN. This war is documented live on the social media. People see the pictures, and the images of atrocities of death and suffering the moment it happens. Essentially, look at those pictures and see where this kind of rhetoric may lead. The rhetoric, these traditional values of rhetoric of the global resistance to globalization, whatever. This dichotomic, dualistic worldview that sees that contraposes different parts of the world against each other. Look at where where these ideas may lead to destruction, suffering, and death.
Thank you very much, Father Cyril. I hope that your words will reach as many people as possible.